And joining us now in studio, Kelly McGonigal, author of The Willpower Instinct. Hello, nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you too. Thanks for having me.
Okay, I want to start sort of the beginning, because when I think of willpower, I think of my inability or ability to resist or give in to temptation. Is that what willpower is?
That's one part of willpower. I actually call that won't power, the ability to not do something even when every cell in your body says, I want to eat this or smoke this or drink this. But there are two other components of willpower that are just as important. One is what I call I will power, and that's the ability to do something even though maybe it's hard or uncomfortable or some part of you would rather put it off. So sometimes we have to restrain ourselves, but sometimes we really have to motivate and propel ourselves. And the third aspect of willpower is what I call I want power. And that's something we rarely think about. But it's a real skill to be able to keep your goals and your values in mind so that when you're tempted by something or distracted by something, that some part of you remembers what your long-term goals are. So I will, I won't, and I want.
And the three of them play together in tandem.
They do.
Okay, why is all this important in modern society?
Well, it turns out that willpower is kind of like intelligence. It's a general strength that improves everything. And in fact, willpower is a better predictor of how well you do in school or how successful you are at work than intelligence. People who have more willpower, they're happier in their relationships, their marriages last longer, and they actually even live longer. So it seems like it basically is this ability to do what matters most, even when we have other conflicting goals or opportunities.
You said I would do better in school if I had more willpower. How does that work?
Yeah, I mean, a big part of willpower is the ability to remember what your goals are and to choose to do things that are consistent with those goals. So maybe you need to study instead of watch TV, or maybe you need to be able to calm down your anxiety when you're faced with a test so that you can actually focus on the work at hand instead of getting overwhelmed by your emotions. And this ability to regulate what's going on inside of you, your thoughts and your emotions, and also all of the temptations and distractions around you. I mean, that is, the key to success.
Okay, key to success in my marriage, you also, for willpower, is also evident in my marriage. So explain that one to me.
Well, I mean, besides the obvious, it's good not to be fooling around on the side. I mean, that takes a little bit of willpower for some. But even just small things like, do you know how to sustain attention to your partner? Or are you constantly distracted, whether you're texting or, doing the dishes and avoiding your partner? That's an aspect of willpower. Are you able to control your emotions so that every time you're irritated, you don't fly off the handle and take it out on your partner? And again, this ability to pay attention and to regulate your emotions, that's all fueled by willpower.
We hear, when we talk about self-control, it's sort of like think of it in sort of a modern sense. It goes along with things like ambition, which is a big word we use all the time. But why do we have willpower? Is it something innate in us?
It is. It's a basic survival strategy. And in fact, if you think about humans, we have two different main strategies for survival. There's the part that we're used to thinking about where, we eat something if we're hungry, or we run away if we're scared, or we'll defend ourselves if we're under attack. We have these kind of base instincts for survival. And it seems like we evolved this other strategy for survival that is basically to slow us down so we don't get into trouble. And so we have this ability to keep longer-term goals in mind. And it evolved because humans are such social creatures that it's no longer enough just to eat something when you're hungry or mate with the first opportunity you have. But we actually need this ability to slow down so that we don't get into trouble with all those other instincts.
But the modern world is, much different than the environment, say, like 100,000 years ago, and the challenges that our ancestors faced. So how does this disconnect between the two worlds create willpower challenges?
Yeah, so if you think of, neuroscientists think of us as having one brain but two different minds. These two different survival strategies are two ways of relating to the world. And back when our brains were evolving, we didn't have quite so many temptations and distractions all of the time. This ability to exert willpower, it was more like something you did every now and then when you were really confronted with a conflict. But in our modern world, we have temptations all the time, distractions all the time. And so we have a brain that really hasn't caught up to the fact that we're living in a society that requires a lot more willpower than maybe when this ability originally evolved.
It's important, you argue, to not, though, view our primitive self as sort of the enemy and try to conquer him or her. Explain to me why you say that.
I mean, this is something a lot of us have. We feel like our cravings or our desires or our the stress and anxieties, we sometimes think of that as being like the bad self, and we think we need to control that version of us or even get rid of it. But we need that part of ourselves too. I mean, there's plenty of research if you look at medical case histories of people who've had brain damage to areas that create stress or create fear or even create desires. Those people aren't doing too well. You know, they might be depressed, or they might be unable to get out of bed in the morning, or we actually need both aspects of ourselves. And sometimes when we talk about self-control, we think that I'm going to be this supremely controlled person who has no desire and no stress and no feelings, and that's not very functional either.
We become robots.
Yeah, no, we need a balance.
You talk about in your book about the famous story of Phineas Gage. You said looking at past cases. Yeah. Tell me the story.
Well, this is a case from 1848, and we're still talking about it 150 years later because it is it taught us so much about where self-control lives in the brain. Phineas Gage was a young man who worked for the American Railroad, and his job was to lay down explosives so that they could, blow up rocks and make way for the railroad. So one day he's tamping down the explosives, and the explosion goes off too soon, and his tamping iron goes right through his head and literally blows through an area of the brain right behind the forehead called the prefrontal cortex. And you would think, well, that must have killed him, but incredibly it didn't. And they were able to grab pieces of the skull off the ground and put his head back together. But he lost a big chunk of this area of the brain behind the forehead, and his entire personality changed. So even though he seemed to heal, he'd been such a righteous, upstanding, hardworking man before. And suddenly he was impulsive. He would make all these plans but not follow through with them. He was cursing and swearing, and he was basically, it was as if he'd lost all ability to censor himself, and all of his animal instincts were unleashed. And that was really the first case study that taught us how important this particular area of the brain behind the forehead is. And that's where self-control seems to live in the brain.
It lives in that prefrontal cortex.
Yeah, and what's fascinating is so most of us don't have to worry about having a tamping iron blow through our skull.
Thankfully, that's one of the things I can put off my work list. Yes.
But there are a lot of things we do every day that give us what neuroscientists call temporary brain damage. So we can become a little bit like Phineas Gage from things like getting drunk, which we know is not great for self-control, but one of the reasons is it actually puts that area of the brain to sleep. And speaking of sleep, sleep deprivation is another thing that turns us into a little bit of a Phineas Gage, that when we don't get enough sleep, the first area of the brain that becomes sluggish and less responsive is the prefrontal cortex. And so if you don't sleep enough, you're more susceptible to stress and temptations and all the things we usually try to control.
Gaining weight.
Gaining weight. In fact, actually, researchers now think that one of the reasons there's been such an increase in obesity the last couple of decades is because people are sleeping less than they used to.
Is there any payoff to having this thing? You talk about the need to meditate in the book.
Oh, yeah. So while there are lots of things that can impair the prefrontal cortex, you can actually increase the size and the efficiency of your prefrontal cortex by meditating. And there's actually a couple of things that seem to train the brain in this way. Physical exercise is another one. So I usually tell people, if you want more willpower, you can sleep more or meditate. Even as little as 5 minutes a day has been shown to literally beef up the willpower center of the brain. Or you can exercise. And exercise seems to make the brain healthier, specifically in the self-control regions.
So I don't need to escape to some ashram in India to meditate. I can
You don't.
5 minutes a day in the comfort of my own home.
Yeah, and particularly breath-focused meditation. So nothing complicated. You just sit down and you focus your attention on your breath.
Okay, we've all heard of the flight or fight response. You argue that willpower is like stress, but that it's also a very physical bodily response.
Yeah.
How does it manifest itself that way?
In fact, it's actually the opposite of the stress fight or flight response. So, I talked about these two different survival strategies. Fight or flight, get your heart rate up, your blood pressure up, all of your energy, your blood sugar goes to your muscles to help you run or to fight. And the willpower response is the opposite of that. Your heart rate slows down. Your breathing slows down, your blood pressure lowers, and all that energy, instead of going to your muscles, it actually gets shunted up to your prefrontal cortex so that your brain has the energy it needs to slow you down. And this whole mind-body response is really about slowing you down so that you actually don't do something that might get you into trouble. And it's actually really interesting if you look at people who are struggling with willpower and you tempt them or you distract them, you can predict whether or not they'll give in by whether they have this kind of typical stress response or whether they show this slowing down response. One study looked at alcoholics and would put a glass of alcohol in front of them and look at whether their heart rate sped up or slowed down. And that actually predicted whether or not people would be able to stay sober.
So if my heart rate sped up, I would have...
You'd be more likely to drink and more likely to fall off the wagon over time.
Right.
Because you're having a kind of stress response. And so one of the neat things about learning all of this from the science of willpower is that we can actually learn to slow down our breath and slow down our heart and have this calmer response when we're in the face of temptation or distractions.
So stress is the enemy of willpower.
It basically is. And in every way you can think about it. I mean, stress pushes us to prioritize immediate gratification and immediate survival. And so we're going to express our emotions, or we're going to, eat that tempting piece of cake. And willpower is the opposite. It requires us to have this big picture view and to think about what's going to happen 10 months, 10 years down the line.
Okay, that's no longer a glass of pretend alcohol, it's now a piece of cheesecake.
Okay.
What's happening in my brain when I'm looking at, I like cheesecake, so what's happening in my brain?
Well, so there are two things that happen. First of all, if that were a cheesecake and you like cheesecake, you're going to have a craving probably first. And the area of your brain that produces the feeling of wanting something is going to release a chemical called dopamine that's going to make you now obsessed with this cheesecake. And you're going to start to feel like you must have this cheesecake. It's the only thing that can make you happy. And at the same time, your brain may start to produce stress hormones too. So now not only do you think that cheesecake is going to make you happy, you're going to start to feel this anxiety like, I have to get that cheesecake or I'm going to die. Okay, so your brain is now doing its best to make you eat this cheesecake. If you are lucky, if you have thought about goals for health, and this is presuming, of course, that you don't want to eat that cheesecake, because if you have no conflict with the cheesecake, you should just eat it. But let's say that you're maybe trying to maintain your health or lose weight. If your brain recognizes that you're about to do something that conflicts with that goal, that's when the prefrontal cortex is going to slam down the brakes. And that's when you're going to see this change in the body and in the heart rate. And the prefrontal cortex, in theory, should be able to talk to the cravings and the stress centers of your brain and make you no longer want that cheesecake so much.
Okay, my brain isn't working that way because I'm now eating the cheesecake. And what's happening to me, though, while I'm eating that cheesecake is I'm feeling terribly guilty about it.
Oh, yeah, that doesn't help. Very common. In fact, the relationship between guilt and willpower is fascinating because most people think that guilt will give you more willpower. So you may think, like, the worse I feel about eating this cheesecake, it's going to make me stop. But in fact, there are even studies where they induce guilt, and they ask people to think about how guilty they'll feel if they eat a piece of cake. And the first thing you find is that makes people think eating the cake will make them happier. We have this natural association between guilt and pleasure. So as soon as you're feeling guilty about something, you actually expect it to taste better and to make you happier. So it's going to fuel your continued doing of whatever you feel guilty about. And then the other problem is that guilt is a kind of stress. And so it actually makes the brain more susceptible to temptation. It makes it harder to find your self-control. And guilt, like stress, turns out to be one of the big enemies of being able to slow down and control yourself.
Just so you know, your head has now turned into a cheesecake. As I look at you. No. I'm kidding. How does marketing play into all this?
Well, people who want your money actually know a lot about this research. And there are a lot of strategies to try to get your brain to want something. And so if you were to, say, walk into a store or the mall, you may notice that there are some really wonderful smells in the environment. And that's because researchers know that smells produce this chemical dopamine and this state of wanting. And when you smell something good, it actually makes your brain look for something to buy because it's in the state of heightened expecting a reward. And so now there's a lot of scent marketing that's trying to get you to buy things. You can also create wants or desires just by associating a product with something we know triggers natural desires. I mean, we know that sex sells, but it's not just sex. But basically, we're living in a world that's trying to hijack the survival instinct because they know that if they can get your brain to produce this chemical, you're going to be in this kind of frenzied state where you won't be satisfied until you buy something.
Okay, but you know how I'm supposed to deal with that, so tell me what I do.
Well, so first of all, what's interesting is that when you bring awareness to this process, it already starts to change the process. There's something about the automaticity of all of this that makes it work. So if you're aware that someone is trying to manipulate you, already it's less effective. And I teach this class, The Science of Willpower. And one of the first things I have students do if they struggle with temptation is to go out into the world and be like a detective and look for the ways that people are trying to trick you. Smells in stores or signs, or you can get the dopamine firing in your brain just by promising someone a sale or a discount. And to look at all these things that might be your particular triggers. And as soon as you're aware of that and you know what it feels like to be in the state of wanting, it actually gives you more self-control. Awareness itself starts to shift the brain into self-control mode.
So I walk into the mall, I now know that they're trying to dupe me. The fact that I'm aware of that.
It actually gives people more self-control. And it's funny because people don't always predict that would be true, but try it next time you're out at the mall. And it's like you'll be in on the joke. And it's a lot harder for these unconscious forces to determine our behavior when we know that they're working.
Does willpower work only on an individual basis, or does it work on a societal level as well?
It's interesting because it seems like we evolved willpower because of how complex our societies were becoming. And so in some ways that's good. But it also turns out that humans, because we're so profoundly social, our brains seem to be built to follow what other people are doing. And so there's research suggesting that we can catch willpower, but we can also catch temptation and bad behaviors from other people. And there's a lot of thinking now that one of the reasons we see these changes in society towards greater obesity or towards addiction or away from addiction is because of how social we are and how contagious these behaviors are. So you may think that you have a lot of willpower and you aren't influenced by others, but we actually will pick up quite a bit on what other people are doing.
So willpower is contagious?
Willpower is contagious.
Okay, I can catch it from you.
You can catch it. So, for example, let's say we're friends and we both smoke. If I quit smoking, research suggests that down the line, you're much more likely to quit smoking than if I hadn't. But it's also contagious in the other direction. So if I pick up a bad habit, you're more likely to pick it up. Or if I gain weight, you're more likely to gain weight over time. And part of that is just because our thoughts about what is normal and what is good is based on what other people are doing. And so that's just sort of very natural.
I want to put it in the context of the time that we're living in. We're always being told about the economy, about the distress that it's in, about austerity. Does willpower play into, even a more collective experience?
Well, so one thing we know is that whatever's going on in our economy or in our culture, it actually has a big impact on our willpower. So whenever the economy goes down or when there's an increase in terrorism, for example, research shows that the stress that people feel drives them to more behaviors we would typically control. So after a terrorist attack or when the economy is going down, people will eat more junk food, they're more likely to smoke or go back to smoking, they drink more. And there's something about this collective stress that undermines our individual willpower.
Is there proof of that in the post-2008 economic crisis? We're drinking more, we're smoking more, we're getting fatter?
And you know what's so fascinating is it also is totally illogical. I mean, there's one study that came out around that time showing that the more worried people were about the economy and their debt, the more likely they were to shop to feel better. And again, it's this disconnect because when we're under stress, we actually lose the ability to really think long term. So even if we're stressed out about money, we may be more likely to spend money to try to soothe ourselves in the short term.
Okay, that's our problem. I want to talk a little bit about the fix. So I need more self-control. How do I do that? It acts how?
Well, so one of the most exciting things to come out of the science of willpower in the last decade is this idea of self-control as a muscle, something that you can train. And it turns out that when you start to think more about willpower, even just bring some attention to it, you tend to get more willpower. So first of all, just even defining everyday life challenges as being something that requires you to do this thing of remembering your goals, of slowing down, of not being in stress, just thinking of it in that way gives people more self-control. And then you can also start to exercise your willpower muscle. So let's say you have a specific goal. Maybe you want to get out of debt, save money, or maybe you want to lose weight. To pick something small that you're going to do that's consistent with that goal, and do that every day until it's easy. And it turns out that creating this kind of willpower workout for yourself gives you more willpower and strengthens self-control. And the thing is, most of us, we wait for it to get easy to start. We think like, tomorrow I'll wake up and I won't want to eat that cheesecake, or tomorrow I'll wake up and I won't want to buy something. But if you think of yourself as a willpower athlete, it's easier to realize that you actually have to do something a little bit difficult, but it gets easier with time.
Let's stay with the athlete analogy. If I'm a good runner, generally I'm probably better at other sports as well than someone who's not an athlete in one sport. So if I exert a lot of self-control in one area, let's take losing weight, focusing on that, am I going to succeed at another, or am I going to fail at that one?
Well, it depends on whether you look at the short term or the long term. And it actually is a lot like physical exercise. So someone who runs on a regular basis, they are going to be better at dancing or swimming or walking. But if they just ran a marathon, they're going to be exhausted. And you ask them, to go for a walk, and it's not going to be easy. So it seems to be the same with willpower. That if you strengthen your willpower, you're used to challenging yourself, you are going to be better at other forms of willpower too. So, going through the process of losing a lot of weight will probably also give you the ability to conquer procrastination or control your temper in the long term. But research also shows that when you're in those first stages of doing something really difficult, it is a lot harder to manage other areas of your life.
And why is it limited?
Well, it seems to go back to that idea of willpower being a brain response. If we know that our physical muscles are very sensitive to how much energy they use, and your muscles will get tired. And it seems like the prefrontal cortex is like that when you ask your brain to pay attention and control impulses, it gets tired the way muscles do, and your prefrontal cortex will become a little bit more reluctant to do the heavy lifting.
So I have to train my willpower muscle. You say like going to the gym.
Yeah.
I'm going to focus on it, be attentive to it. Are there other things I can do to train it?
Well, pretty much anything you do that requires using your brain in this way will train your willpower. And as we've already talked about, meditation and exercise seem to directly increase this area of the brain and its ability to do hard work. But something people don't often realize is things that don't look like willpower can restore this area of the brain. Things like relaxation. Actually, being in nature seems to restore the prefrontal cortex. Anything that's kind of the opposite of stress. So if you've been spending all day using your willpower and you don't want to go home and clean out the fridge because you're so overwhelmed and out of willpower, you can do these small things like practice yoga, or go for a walk, or even just watch a funny YouTube video has been shown to help the brain sort of reset and restore willpower.
If we go back again through evolution, why was this limit a benefit?
It's interesting. Because the brain is tracking how much energy you have, literally, how much blood sugar you have, it seems like it's using that as a proxy for how much food is in your environment. So you have to imagine, go back, hundreds of thousands of years ago when it was really hard to get food. Now, not so hard. But the brain would use the levels of energy that are available to you as a measure for how secure your environment was. And if the brain thinks that if there's not a lot of energy available right now, if we're using a lot of energy, it may not be that abundant in our environment. And so the brain actually will push you to take more risks, to eat food whenever it's available, even to mate. Research shows that when you're low in physical energy or blood sugar, you're more willing to cheat on your spouse, and you're more willing to take big risks. And the idea is that if there's not a lot of food in your environment, it would make sense to take risks. But the funny thing is now the brain is still using low blood sugar as this proxy for something that's not the case at all. And this is why people say you shouldn't make important decisions when you're hungry, and you certainly shouldn't go shopping when you're hungry.
I want to give you one last example. Jared Diamond's collapse, he details the large-scale deforestation of Easter Island society, and which privileged this short-term impulsive gain over long-term goals. So given what you have now taught me and what you know about willpower, should we heed this warning and not write it off simply as like, well, those were primitive civilization that didn't know any better, or should we follow some of that advice?
I think we do need to think about this. I mean, how many times have I heard people say, what were they thinking? Like cutting down the trees and turning to cannibalism? Like, couldn't somebody see where this was heading before the civilization completely collapsed? And we do tend to think that we're above all of that. But I think we are replicating that a lot in our own society, making choices that are not sustainable. And I think this is a fundamental aspect of what it means to be human, to have these two minds in one brain. And unless we make a very conscious choice to try to predict the future and override our tendency to privilege immediate outcomes, I mean, I think it's not too strong to say we might be headed in that same direction.
Okay, we're going to continue our conversation
Okay.
tomorrow, but I do want to ask you before we go, what's your biggest willpower challenge?
Well, I'm someone who's definitely used the ideas in the book to help me shop less. But my biggest willpower challenge has actually been more related to that idea of I will and overcoming anxiety or overcoming discomfort. And it's flying. And I actually have to use willpower to do something that is physically uncomfortable, that makes me nervous. And I think it's a good example of being willing to do something that is uncomfortable because it's consistent with how you want your life to be.
Thank you very much. We will continue our conversation tomorrow. We'll see you then.
Support Ontario's public television. Donate at tvo.org.